Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading you two things. The first is a chapter from a book I loved by Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie. And it's in this little crazy treasury of Christmas stories that I think I bought when I was in 6th grade. And I've had it ever since. But this is Mr. Edwards Meets Santa Claus by Laura Ingalls Wilder. The days were short and cold. The wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. Cold rains were falling. Day after day the rain fell, pattering from the roof and pouring from the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close by the fire, sewing their 9 patch quilt blocks or cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper and hearing the wet sound of the rain. Every night was so cold that they expected to see snow in the morning, but in the morning they saw only sad, wet grass. They pressed their noses against the squares of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad they could see out, but they wished they could see snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near, and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in Indian territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know. "What day is it?" they asked her anxiously. "How many more days until Christmas?" And they counted off the days on their fingers until there was only one more day left. Rain was still falling that morning. There was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure that there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. The clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in a clear blue sky. The sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sparkled on the grasses. But when Ma opened the door to let in the fresh, cold air, they heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew they would have no Christmas because Santa Claus could not cross that roaring creek. Pa came in bringing a fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said he'd eat it feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for a Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of the drumsticks?" She said yes, she could, but she was sober. Then Mary asked him if the creek was going down, and he said it was still rising. Ma said it was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with him, but Pa shook his head and said a man would risk his neck trying to cross that creek now. "No," he said, "that current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow." Of course, that meant that Santa Claus could not come either. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by and such a turkey for their Christmas dinner. Ma said so, and it was true. Ma said that it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but that they were such good girls, he hadn't forgotten them, and he would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They lay down in bed, pulled the covers up. It did not seem at all like Christmas. Pa and Ma sat silent by the fire. After a while, Ma asked why Pa didn't play the fiddle, and he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Carolyn." After a longer while, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls. Maybe something will happen." Laura's heart jumped, but then she thought again of the creek, and she knew that nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. "Now go to sleep," Ma said, kissing them goodnight. "Morning will come quicker if you're asleep." She sat down by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, "You've only made it worse, Carolyn." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar." But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely, The door latch rattled and someone said, "Ingalls! Ingalls!" Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. "Great fish hooks, Edwards! Come in, man! What's happened?" Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stocking limply dangling, and she scrooged her shut eyes into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, when he got warm. "It was too big a risk," Edwards' Pa said. "We're glad you're here, but that was too big a risk for Christmas dinner." "Your little ones ought to have a Christmas," Mr. Edwards replied. "No creek could stop me after I've fetched their gifts from Independence." Laura sat straight up in bed. "Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Mr. Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried. Wait a minute," Mr. Edwards laughed. "And Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings, as Santa Claus intended. She said they mustn't look." Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said he had known that Santa Claus could not get across it. "But you crossed it," Laura said. "Yes," said Mr. Edwards, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it where a long, lean razorback like me could do so." And Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no farther south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. "In the rain?" Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street, he had met Santa Claus. "In the daytime?" Laura asked. She hadn't thought that anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. "No," Mr. Edwards said, "it was night, but light shone out across the street from the saloons." Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, "Hello, Edwards." "Did he know you?" Mary asked. And Laura asked, "How did you know he was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest, whitest set of whiskers west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shuck bed in Tennessee." And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa had left for him that time. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living way down along the Verdigris River. Have you ever met up yonder two little girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "It rests heavy on my mind," said Santa. "They are both of them sweet, pretty good young little things, and I know they're expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint good little girls like them. Yet, with the water up the way it is, I can't ever make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year, Edwards. Would you do me the favor to fetch their gifts this one time?" "I'll do that, and with pleasure," Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where the pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he couldn't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest. And Santa unhitched the pack, looked through it, took out the presents for Mary and Laura. "Oh, what are they?" Laura cried, but Mary asked, "Then what did he do?" He shook hands with Mr. Edwards, and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. "So long, Edwards," he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge Trail, leading his pack mule and whistling. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of that. Then Ma said, "You may look now, girls." Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one just like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again, and they pulled out 2 long, long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just one lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take 1 lick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out 2 small packages. They unwrapped them and each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. But at last, Laura turned hers over and she just nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath where it wouldn't show. And inside of that little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary never would have looked in their stockings again. The cups and cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak. But Ma asked if they were sure the stockings were empty. Then they put their arms down inside them to make sure, and in the toe of each stocking was a shining, bright, new penny. They had never even thought of such a thing as having a penny. Think of having a whole penny for your very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. There had never been such a Christmas. Now, of course, right away, Mary and Laura should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing those lovely presents all the way from Independence, but they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They'd even forgotten Santa. In a minute, they would have remembered, but before they did, Ma said gently, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards, thank you," they said, and they meant it with all of their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hands too, and they shook it again, and Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying, and Laura didn't know why, so she gazed again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped. Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they had helped to balance the package on his head when he swam across the street. He thought Pa and Ma might like some with a Christmas turkey. There were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too. It was just too much. Pa said so. "It's too much, Edwards," he said. They never could thank him enough. Mary and Laura were much too excited to eat breakfast. They drank the milk from their shining new cups, but they could not swallow the rabbit stew and cornmeal mush. "Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It'll soon be dinner time." For Christmas dinner, there was the tender, juicy roasted turkey. There were the sweet potatoes baked in the ashes and carefully wiped so that you could eat the skins too. There was a loaf of salt-rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there were stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made with brown sugar and did not have the white sugar sprinkled over their tops. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank water out of their new cups. And little by little, they sucked their sticks of candy till each stick was sharp-pointed on one end. That was a happy Christmas. Now, I love that story. Now, this is a very different kind of little story written. I saved this newspaper reading, so it'll probably rustle a little, but it's from 2006 when Christopher Hyde used to write about music in the Portland Press Herald, and he was kind of a festively cantankerous chap sometimes, so you'll see this certainly. The name of this is "Ever Wonder Why the Carol Accompanist is So Grouchy?" Okay, Christmas is not a good holiday for amateur musicians. If there is a piano in the house, tradition, or the memory of tradition, dictates that relatives, children, and guests gather around to sing carols to his or her accompaniment. There are people I envy who can do this, men and women who have accompanied church choirs for many years and are on intimate terms with the hymn book, but I am not one of them. I would rather sight read my way through a Beethoven sonata or Gaspard de la Nuit than try to play the typical Christmas carol at tempo with all 4 parts. I've been trying to understand why this should be so. Most Christmas carols are relatively simple homophonic melodies with the kinds of chords that can be written in shorthand for guitar. For example, Joy to the World begins with a simple descending scale of all 8 notes, and most of the others, even if written by Mendelssohn, are not much more difficult. The first problem with playing carols is lack of practice. After all, they're sung in large part for just 12 days out of the year. And because they are so simple, one imagines that they can be sight-read with ease, at tempo, with a just distribution of parts. Wrong on all counts. I find that after the 3rd verse, one becomes familiar enough with the structure that the playing improves noticeably, but by that time, it's too late. The singers have moved on to Frosty the Snowman. Such popular songs as Frosty or Here Comes Santa Claus are even worse than hymns. The arrangements are usually bad, but the singers have heard them so many times in the mall that they expect anyone who can read notes to perform them automatically. This is especially true of children who assume that all adults are virtuosi. Not only are the arrangements bad, but they are full of incomprehensible, page-ripping repeats. Try playing the 12 Days of Christmas, for example. Tempo is also a major problem. Most singers tend to take Deck the Halls or Jingle Bells with too much gusto. If one tries to play all the notes, the music begins to sound like a funeral march. The vocalists will try to speed you up with predictable results. What I really object to, however, is the way that melodies are written in hymn books. Every one seems to bristle with tenths for the left hand because someone wanted to combine the bass and tenor voices in the bass clef. Unless one has hands bigger than Rachmaninoff's, the tenor note has to be transferred instantaneously to the right hand. Would it have been too much trouble to write manageable intervals? Or would that confuse the severely limited number of us who part sing from the score? And then the arranger always has to write some kind of tweedle-deedle-deedle between the homophonic chords, which is impossible to manage on the fly unless you want to practice Angels from the Realms of Glory like a Chopin etude. Key signatures will also throw you for a loop. Writers of carol collections usually stick to a small number of sharps and flats, although they will occasionally venture into A flat major, the key of amorous love that is also the most difficult to play, or the 3 sharps of A major. Just when one is getting used to 3 sharps, the next time will be 1 flat or 2 or 3. Singing carols at a sing-along tends to flow from "We 3 kings" to "Hark the herald angels sing" with lightning speed, and it becomes hard to figure out immediately where one is on the keyboard. I have a modest proposal, which is seconded by the great pianist and transcriber Ferruccio Busoni. Write all Christmas carols in C major. Busoni contended that since the invention of equal temperament, all intervals were the same in every key, so it didn't matter what the key signature of a work was. It would sound the same, whether it was played in C or F sharp. Accomplished accompanists do this all the time, change the key to suit the vocal range of the singer. People might object that transposing all carols to C major would result in too many sharps and flats in order to follow the melody, but it couldn't be any worse than switching key signatures 3 times in 5 minutes, and I'd be willing to bet that most people couldn't tell the difference. The next step, of course, would be to sing all the carols a cappella so that the fine distinctions of the intervals would be maintained. But that's the way Renaissance voices does it, but not as many people would sing carols. There's something about a piano that awakens the desire. Thank heaven for Silent Night. I can read that, and it usually ends the session on a high note.